So um, again, realizing that policy in terms of like what we know it as of like this strictly state level uh, government style implementation of some need to fix a problem. Um, if we just expand out the definition, uh, it could be basically everything that causes us to change our minds, right? If we perceive a problem or simply like uh, a simple like household policy, right? Um, we're out of food, right? Do we just go to the grocery store when we need food, or do we do weekly shopping trips? If you do weekly shopping trips, you have instituted a shopping or food gathering policy, right? Um, and as long as you're kind of abiding by that policy, it still exists as a policy until you change it or get rid of it. And again, so this is a fascinating thing, and policy is literally a vehicle for culture change, which is really what early anthropologists were looking for, right? Is what is it that's changing? Margaret Mead went in the field to look at the Samoans to see how the kind of missionaries were affecting social change and adolescent behavior. She really wanted to focus on change more than the adolescent stuff. But the change, I mean, it could be policy, but it has a lot to do with power, right? So let's look at a missionary um, style kind of colonialism moving into a Pacific island where people hadn't been exposed before, right? Well, the missionaries show up and they instantly try to influence policy, which is who's the leadership, who am I going to be talking to? So that whole creating chiefdoms is one of them. Then they start instituting like going to church on Sundays is mandatory as a policy. Um, then the culture groups themselves have this dialectic back and forth with themselves and the individuals in terms of like how does this shift who we are? What policy changes are we going to make? So it could be argued when looking at religion that syncretism, that blending, that hybridization of religious ideas is a personal policy and a group policy in order to keep and maintain traditional ties to belief systems. So some policy negotiation is also in there. And remember, policy itself is a process, right? There are policy or cultural actors that are in play. There is a perceived social need and or problem, right? There's a potential solution, right? And I would say that when the missionaries show up, what they're going to tell the people is that their problem is that they're sinning, that they're not obeying the word of God. They've created a problem societally that this group of people didn't know that they had prior, which is a whole nother issue, which is basically pointing out a policy solution, which is go to church and be converted. This is all kind of fascinating stuff. I'm moving through my kind of research on this and am pursuing a PhD in this topic area. So I could talk weeks on just anthropology of policy. So in the name of that, I am going to move on. National policy impacts on culture. Policy can unite, like during World War II, with rationing and high tax rates, right? If the verbiage, this also policy has a lot to do with language and the power of language, and we'll talk about language in the next couple of weeks. Everyone worked for a common cause. This was seen as kind of the time to be an American. Your political ideas were very low tertiary. They're down the list compared to the bigger issues of winning the war against Hitler and Imperial Japan. Policy can divide, like welfare cuts, tax policy, so tax cuts, tax hikes. We got a tax cut last year at the federal level, and now the deficits are skyrocketing, which wasn't happening prior. But that's what's going to happen. However, now the conversation is becoming how do we fix the deficits, and the response by the conservative kind of side of the binary structure that we have is cutting Social Security and Medicare, because those are kind of the entitlements that we have in the country, even though people pay into those things. Cutting the benefits because they're perceived as costing too much for the country. And America goes like this on this idea, right? We want more money, less taxes. Then they start cutting our programs, and we say, well, maybe taxes on the wealthier are okay, so that we are better off and not bankrupting ourselves in the hospitals. So this is again, it's going to divide or bring us together. A lot of these issues that we're talking about have divided us. And then this goes along with Gluckman's conflict theory. All policy has some kind of cultural impact, no matter what. So even tax policy is going to have some kind of impact on people, whether it be that they're going to spend more money now that they have more money in their pocket, or they now have more money, but they don't save the money for kind of hospital visits and stuff like that. So we give more freedom of money in people's pockets, but that has social repercussions. And our political leaders decide on these changes. So this is the thing. Hopefully, if you voted, even though most of the public is not voting these days, if you voted, you have symbolically passed over your power, at least handed over your power of process, power to do, right, to another individual in representative democracy, okay, or voted direct democracy on an initiative at California level. Perfect example of self-government. I've talked a lot about self-government, direct democracy. David Graeber did too. State level fighting for policy, banning plastic bags is another one. The marijuana legalization is another one, right? And these are all kind of direct democracy policy changes. International policy and culture. The United Nations Bill of Rights. This is another topic that we could spend days and days on. Free trade policies tend to create alliances and cultural acceptance using reciprocity. These are all state, global level things that we're tying anthropological concepts and theory to. Again, free trade tends to create a mutual dependency. So if China and us are free trading and we have a bunch of goods, and now our economies are dependent on that good exchange, that reciprocity, the market reciprocity, really, now we're less likely to go to war. So it has a lot of peace things tied to it. This is why the country really got away from tariffs post depression, post-depression, World War II era. We really went way more towards free trade, which is which now we're going back to tariffs. So this has some major implications. It's definitely much more isolationism, much more take care of the nation. We saw all this in the 1920s. If you want to research kind of the political structure that we have now, that is occupying all levels of government and is also operating on a similar economic level, go back and research the 1920s. Harding, Coolidge, Hoover presidencies, the Roaring Twenties, Prohibition, all that time period, really had a lot of similarities in terms of economics and political structure. Nationalism turns into isolationism and protectionism, rejects the global culture, and instead creates an us versus them mentality. Remember, so the attempt is to first, we have a us versus them mentality with our political parties. But then the other version is like, how do we create an in-group, out-group with nations? And this is what tariffs and nationalism will do. It creates an us, America, versus the rest of the world. This, I believe, is also an attempt to bring people together. In terms of the political party kind of, togetherness, this is really what America did in kind of the 20s and 30s in terms of isolationism. It had this kind of nationalistic fervor, and basically it was kind of like, well, this is America, we're going to be America, and you guys can do what you want. It's an attempt to bridge those surgical cultural cuts that we've had with the last election. So this is an interesting kind of phenomenon that happens as well, is this nationalism. Remember, nationalism is more of an imagined community. We don't actually know the people in Kansas, and we don't necessarily know that they're just like us. It's this kind of weird, fictitious belief system that we have around nationalism. Neoliberalism and culture. Neoliberalism, here's a good definition: deregulation, right? Which means take government regulations off things, which is what's happening kind of in the banking system. Remember the last crash in 2008? We put a bunch of regulations on banks, making it safer for lenders so that everybody wouldn't lose their 401ks. We're now loosening those up again because, in the name of free market and capitalism and privatization, we believe that this is more important, right? That market expansion is more important than actually keeping people safe in terms of market stability. So there is this kind of belief that market expansion is better than stability, right? Which means we get 4% GDP growth rather than 2% growth, but 2% growth means that we're not going to have another recession for a very long time, if ever, if we do it right. But instead, we have this market expansion mode, which usually leads to some contractions. We have all kinds of things like inflation and isolationism starts to cause major trading imbalances and some of these other things. It's basically privatization of the public commons. We've also seen a huge push towards opening up public lands for oil expansion and or selling them off. This is, again, neoliberal ideas. Global capitalism, expanding multinational corporations. Anthropologists look at culture change in the process of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is basically a new version of economic imperialism. So like how I was telling you earlier that anthropology came out of this colonial imperialistic time, it gives anthropologists another kind of view of phenomenon, which is let's go into rural India and see what a Coca-Cola plant going into an indigenous community and stealing their river looks like, right? It ends up turning anthropologists into advocate or activist anthropologists. Lessening power of local culture through the promise of advancement and development. This has always been the promise of neoliberalism and even colonial imperialism. I would say that neoliberalism, the term is tough, right? Liberal usually means liberties and freedom, right? And this is exactly what it's being related to. It's not your liberal Democrat who believes in commons and socialization and some of these other things in terms of the commons. But again, neoliberal is more like neo freedoms for economy. It should actually be neo economic imperialism, because that's really what it is. It's the takeover. And smaller cultures basically get bumped out of the way, but they get promised these new things. I've visited Cambodia. I've visited plenty of these developing nations, and they all have factories, and they're all making clothes and soccer balls for us over here, and they're getting paid $5 a week. And they're promised these great things. Well, with that $5 a week, they end up buying things like Coca-Cola and garbage food that we're selling to them for the American dream. This is quite a remarkable conundrum that neoliberalism puts anthropologists and cultural groups into. Sell us your land and you'll be rich. This is an enticing element, leads to cultural degradation in the home or in the name of becoming a player in the game, right? If you sell us our land here, you'll be rich, but we're basically going to destroy all kind of methods and or modes of your cultural norms and or values and your tradition. All right, so in terms of closure, why is policy so tied to culture? Again, I would say that it is that change agent, especially when we do kind of a rough definition of what policy means. What has policy replaced in terms of culture change? The element of hunter-gatherer times, right? These are questions that you should be asking yourselves. How has the UN affected anthropology in terms of cultural relativity? To that, I maybe didn't go into it as much as I should have. Quickly, if the UN, dominated by Western nations, especially because they won the war, right, start to write this list of what human rights are, they really start to avoid cultural norms and identity, and instead replace it with what is right and wrong, right? So this is where the UN, I think, means well, but then ends up overstepping and creating kind of this imperialistic cultural ideal system that other cultures must follow. Otherwise, they're breaking kind of UN code and law policy, really. Okay? And then where does the political power lie in terms of leadership and why? Again, we talked a lot about direct democracy, you having power over the process when you do that. If I create an initiative or vote, that's me having power over the process. When I pass over power of the process, my power to do, which is go out and gather food and work on my own, I have basically jumped into the game of state level society, and that's kind of also passing over my power. All right, that's it for the week. Thank you guys.